Carolyn Palau, and I'm here on behalf of Palisades Village and our events committee. So for those of you who may not know us, our village represents 7 neighborhoods in far northwest Washington, and we and our volunteers, we offer fun and stimulating programs and fellowship and support services for to help aging neighbors like me remain safely and comfortably in our homes, which is where we want to be. So you're in for a rare treat this evening. We're exceedingly proud to present a discussion of the book, High Tension, FDRs Battle to Power America. It's by the author and esteemed Palisades Village member, John A. Riggs. We know John as Jack. Joining the book conversation is another Palisades Village member, volunteer, and author, Greg Mize. So we ask that you use the chat box on your screen to type in your questions, and at the conclusion of the talk, Erica Blanton, our executive director, will read them to Mr. Riggs and we'll have the answers. So thank you, gentlemen. You now have the screen.
Thank you, Carolyn. Erica, did you plan on saying anything at this juncture?
No, I'm going to hold off for right now.
Okay, good. Well, that was a very nice introduction, Carolyn, and we are in for a treat tonight as our fellow Palisades Village member shares his research and insights and passion with us about the battle to power America. High Tension has been featured and applauded by, among other places, the Roosevelt House in New York and the FDR Library, and now the Palisades Village. And as to pick up a jingle before we hear Jack's first answers, like a good neighbor, Jack Riggs is here. And Jack, a very basic question I've wanted to know, and that is, why did you write this book?
Thanks, Greg. But first, I want to say thanks to the village, too, for hosting this. And a special thanks for picking a night when the World Series had an off night.
Yes.
I first started writing this book as something quite different. Back in about 1990, I read Dan Yergin's book about the oil industry, The Prize, which won a Pulitzer, marvelous book. And history has always been my avocation, and energy policy was my vocation. And I couldn't remember a book that I had loved more. I learned so much. So I immediately went to look for a similar book about electricity, and it didn't exist. And so I thought, boy, maybe that would be a good retirement project for me. Well, that was a long time ago, and I put it aside and didn't do anything with it. But the idea never quite died. And when I went to part-time and then fully retired, I took it up and decided that's what I would write. It turned out not to be a whole history of electricity, but I picked a narrower slice of the bigger topic and was able, as Robert Frost said, to marry my avocation and my vocation.
That's beautiful. The book places special significance on FDR's campaign speech in Oregon during his first presidential campaign. Why is that?
Well, it was a good place to start the book because in that speech in 1928, he used electricity as part of his campaign. He had focused on electricity quite a bit as governor of New York, and it was an important issue at the time. It was like high tech today. It was important nationwide. And in that speech, he basically discussed in embryo the major things he was going to do in his administration. The headline nationally was that he called for big federal dams in the 4 corners of the United States, on the Tennessee, the St. Lawrence, the Columbia, and the Colorado. And he was making the speech on the shores of the Columbia, and that got the headlines. But in fact, he talked about rural electrification. He talked about breaking up the huge power trusts, the private electricity industry that was taking advantage of the loose regulation. And it was a narrative device in a sense. It was a way to start the book because it kind of put everything out there.
And what was the essence of the speech?
Well, he mentioned, he talked about how with urban areas getting a lot of electricity, the rural areas had been left out. It was more expensive to run lines to farms, and the private utilities were only interested in profits, so they didn't do it. And it was a hard time. The 20s were a bad decade for farmers anyway, and they were being deprived of this new, modern, wonderful thing that the folks in the cities had. So he talked quite a bit about that. He talked about the interstate holding companies, huge companies that bought up the smaller utilities and basically controlled the industry. And he talked about how that was unfair. And he talked about the desire to create what became the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Bonneville Power Administration in the Northwest. So all that was in the speech, with the heaviest emphasis on the monopoly holding companies and on rural electrification.
He mentioned the accusation of him being a socialist in his speech. Why was he so accused, and how did he respond?
Well, it's no different today. Anybody who wants to do anything fairly progressive or use the government to do something is accused by the opponents of being a socialist. And he wanted to let the government control the nation's rivers and build the dams on them instead of leasing those sites to private power companies. And I don't remember the specific reference, but throughout the whole battle during the New Deal, he was called a socialist anytime he wanted the government to do something.
Now, your title, High Tension, it's got many levels of significance. One being the conflict between public power and private power. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, when electricity started in the US, when Edison created the first utility in downtown Manhattan, and then eventually, and Westinghouse came in with alternating current, and power grew, most of those utilities were either funded locally by local businesses, or they were municipally owned utilities run by the town or the city. And there was a bit of a conflict between whether it would be privately owned or municipally owned. This was still at the local level. But then as the high tension power lines ran across the country and it was much more unified, and the big holding companies took over most of those utilities, including some of the municipal utilities, it was an even stronger conflict between private and public. Some of it was ideological, just as today you would find people who think government should do very little and others who think it should do a lot. And of course the high tension refers both to the political fights that took place during the New Deal, and in a double entendre, the high voltage lines were called high tension wires. So that's where the title came from.
Nice. Yeah, it's very neat. Now, interstate holding companies play a big role in the book. Can you help us understand better how they were organized and why they were organized?
Yeah, the why is easier. The why is so that a few owners at the top can control and take most of the profits out. But they became pyramids. You could have different layers. Say, for example, you've got 3 utilities in 3 adjoining towns. If somebody came in and bought those 3 utilities by creating a holding company over the top of them, the dividends would flow up to that holding company at the top, and the profits and the control, including some contracts that could be lucrative between the top company and the lower companies. All of that was controlled by these few owners at the top. And then somebody might come along and create another holding company to buy up 3 or 4 first-level holding companies. By the time the New Deal came along, there were some holding companies that were 10 layers high, pyramids, with the profits funneling up to a fairly small number of people, and those people being able to buy and sell utilities and set their own prices, they were not regulated because they were interstate, and the only regulation at that time was by states. And so it was an outrage. And Roosevelt and many others were against it, and Roosevelt got himself in a position where he could do something about it.
Is this the beginning of antitrust law, or was there a fight against the consolidation of wealth and control before the electrification issues arose?
This was the beginning in the electricity industry, but of course, in the 19th century, it was the railroads that people were worried about. And then in the Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft era, there were all kinds of monopolies that they were trying to break up, oil and timber, and I can't remember all of them. So it's been a tradition. When an industry gets too big, the government has to find ways to try and control it. And in the 20s, electricity was the big new thing, so important to the economy and to individuals, and it was controlled by a small number of people.
Mm-hmm. Now,
maybe it's like Microsoft and Facebook, the big high-tech companies today.
Yes, I know we have a question from the audience in that vein, and we're going to get to it after a few more introductory Q&As from you, Jack. Why was there such a great disparity between urban and rural electrification? This is a big part of the book that I hope you can expand on. You describe my hometown of Chicago as the most electrified city in the world, but it sounds like it may have been an island or a minority condition. So how did that happen? And well, how did that happen, and why is it an important, I think it's central to the analysis of this book.
In the 1920s, most of the utilities were privately owned, governed by the profit motive, and for legitimate reasons, I guess, they were going to put their next investment dollar into wiring more houses in cities closely located with each other. If you had to run a wire a mile out of the city to get to a farm, and farmers were very poor for the most part in the 1920s, they weren't going to buy much electricity, the utility wouldn't make any money. So they put all of their investment into the cities, almost all of it, and farmers were left behind. They probably didn't have the money to buy electricity at the time or to wire their houses. The 20s were just, crop prices were low for the whole 20s. And the holding companies and the private utilities under them went where the profits were. Now, Chicago was a special case in part because of an interesting guy named Samuel Insull, who worked as kind of a secretary to Thomas Edison when he first came over from England as a young man, and worked his way up to be Edison's business manager. And when the bankers that controlled the Edison company and a couple of the other big electricity companies wanted them to stop competing and consolidate, Edison got forced out of his company, and Insull, who was offered a position in this new company, which was actually General Electric, he wanted to run his own show. He didn't want to be number 3 in General Electric. So he went to Chicago, was hired to take over a small utility there, and over the course of a few years, bought up all of the other utilities in Chicago and Cook County, and adopted some fairly progressive ideas about how to sell electricity and how to market it. He had a philosophy of getting the price down low so people would buy more power. He could put in more generators, and the industry was developing so quickly that each new generation of generators, I guess that's a phrase, each one was a little more efficient than the last one. So he made money by lowering his prices, where most monopolists try to make money by raising their prices. And a lot of others mimicked him, followed his model, but he was the first and the best, and that's why Chicago was so heavily electrified. It's also worth noting that several European countries did much better on rural rural electrification than we did, mostly because they had state-owned utilities, where the national interest, the public interest took held sway over the private interests.
So that European dynamic may have inspired a criticism that we're heading towards socialism?
I don't know why. I don't think they need an excuse today or then to call it socialism if you want the government in something. I think and I imagine most people in the U.S. didn't know that the European systems were different. What motivated it was that farmers were just very unhappy. You know, they'd go into the city and see people with lights on in their house, and utility appliances were people started to have electric stoves, and first they'd start with a fan and an iron, but then they'd have a stove and a refrigerator. The folks in the rural areas, many of them were still living like their grandparents had lived 50, 70 years ago.
Interesting.
That was a powerful political, and Roosevelt used it in his campaign for governor. He claimed to be one of the farmers in New York. Of course, his farm was a little bit different than theirs, but he was a rural resident in New York, and he identified with rural. He was I think, the first Democrat to really cut into the heavily Republican upstate New York vote, largely on the electrification issue.
Now, federal dams play a big role in the expansion of electrification. How did they get built?
The TVA was first, and it was a bit of a leftover from World War I. In World War I, we were worried that all of the nitrates in the country came from Chile. And that's very important for making fertilizer, and it's very important for making weapons. And in the fear that we would lose our access to Chilean nitrates, the government built a dam. They looked around the country and they felt the best place for it was on the Tennessee River. And they built a dam and started to build a nitrates factory. The war was over before they were both finished, but we ended up with a government dam. And very Republican era in the 20s, the government shouldn't own a dam or build a nitrates factory. But some people were arguing that it made sense for the government to own it, to finish it. And that debate was probably one of the most visible and continuous debates during the 1920s. I can remember as a boy probably in the early 50s, at some point hearing my dad talk about the TVA battles in the 20s. It was public versus private, and it was big. And then so when Roosevelt came in, he promised Senator George Norris from Nebraska, who had been pushing TVA legislation, he promised that he would support him. And very quickly after he was elected, they did pass the Tennessee Valley Act, and that led to the building of several dams in the Tennessee Valley Authority was much broader than just electricity. They were trying to promote agriculture and forestry and small industry and so on, but they're best known for the electricity. And Roosevelt also had identified the potential in the Northwest. The Columbia River and its tributaries carry about 40% of the water power in North America. And so within the first few months of the Roosevelt presidential administration, he had issued preliminary grants for the building of Bonneville Dam and Grand Coulee Dam. And that was the start of what became the biggest of the power authorities. And there was opposition. Joe Martin, who later became the Republican Speaker, made some reference to this being socialism. Everett Dirksen, a young congressman at the time, said something about this little baby that you're so proud of is going to grow up to be a monster. It was ideological, but there was plenty of opposition to it. But when Roosevelt was elected, he also got a very large majority in both the House and the Senate, so he could do some of these things. And funding the big dams was one of the first he started with. There was a benefit to it The private industry thought it was unfair, but most of these dams were built with three purposes: navigation, flood control, and electricity. If a private industry wanted to build a dam, they could only justify it on the basis of the electricity, but the government could allocate some of the cost to the navigation and the flood control purposes, which made the cost of the electricity cheaper. It was a bookkeeping gimmick, but it made sense. It does make sense if you can kill three birds with one stone. And that did happen on most of these big dams.
Navigation, that it sounds to me dams work against navigation. How does that become a third purpose?
Well, a navigation, usually if you have a dam, you're going to have, it evens out the flow of the river. If you've got rapids and things like that, it can make it possible to pass those. And you can also put locks around the dams. So, the Tennessee, they had shipping quite far up, and even and in the Columbia, they can go all the way up to the Snake River dams, I think. I'm not an engineer, but it happened. They did it, and it was a benefit.
Now, besides the evident legislative battles that he had to endure, what other kinds of public-private battles took place during these Roosevelt years?
Well, it was one big battle between public and private and their supporters, but it took place in different venues. Obviously, the legislative battles were the most visible one, but there was also a lot of litigation, primarily the private industry trying to have the Tennessee Valley Act and some of the other legislation declared unconstitutional. And they were frequently trying to get injunctions against the first step in many of these processes. And the public relations battle was big. The electricity industry was just a juggernaut of public relations in the 20s. One of their, maybe their lead public relations guy in the national organization said at one point, said, "We used everything to tell our story except skywriting." They actually, the one that struck me as the crassest, they tried to get information into schools, grade schools, high schools, universities, basically telling their story. They would also write stories and editorials for small town papers, and most small town papers are happy to have some copy. So their view on the electricity industry was what was handed to them by the public relations people from industry. But in the material they gave to the schools, one assignment that they drafted for teachers was to have students go home and come back with a paper that told how many electric outlets and how many appliances they had in their house, and then go to 4 of their neighbors and find out how many electric outlets and how many appliances they had. Well, that just started a game of keeping up with the Joneses, because all 4 of those families found out what all their neighbors had, and it was a way to get them to compete with each other. It seems kind of dirty, but I bet it was effective.
Wow, that's very interesting. Now, do you see any significance to this high tension saga and modern times?
Well, the one that a lot of people raise, and I think there may be some legitimacy to it, is the parallel with getting broadband access to rural and remote areas. That would be today's equivalent. I think computers today are like electricity was in the 20s. If you don't have it, you're really falling behind. And I don't know enough about the broadband problem to know what they need to solve it. In rural electrification, basically they were giving credit. It turned out to be given first to rural electric co-ops, who then would give the credit to their members. And it may be, if credit is the main thing we need for broadband access in rural areas, you might be able to look at rural electrification as a model. But we have 2 things. You want to wire the houses, but you also want access for your phones. It's a little more complicated. But that's the one that I've heard mentioned often as a potential parallel.
Did the electrification expansion effort affect the war effort?
Oh, definitely. Well, by the time, it's worth noting that Roosevelt's legislative accomplishments occurred mostly in his first term and maybe the first half of his second term, for a variety of reasons. Partly his court packing scheme, partly the recession within the Depression when the economic advance slowed for a year. He lost some political support, and he was turning his focus towards Europe by the late 30s. It was clear that trouble was arising in Europe, and even if we could stay out of it, it was important to us, and he was focused on it. And he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which was the #2 job in the Navy in World War I. And he was very much aware of the preparedness issues and how important electricity could be. Of course, by the 30s, it was even more important. So he did push to try and get more readiness and more generating capacity. And the two big ones that we turned to in the late 30s and early 40s were TVA and the Bonneville Power Administration. And the private industry was saying, we've got excess capacity, we don't need to do it, and if we need it, we'll build it. Well, private industry can't build quickly. You know, they've got to raise the money, they've got to get the land, whatnot. The government was making these plans years ahead of time. TVA had plans on the books for several dams that they didn't expect to build until well into the 40s. But in the first few years of the European war, even before we got in, they accelerated that. And both TVA and Bonneville made huge, if you look where our munitions industry developed, especially in the Northwest, the cheap power from Bonneville and Grand Coulee led to the aluminum and steel industry out there, which led to all the ship and aircraft building in the Northwest. Electricity was right at the heart of all of that. And we were the arsenal of democracy. And we were providing supplies to our allies in Europe even before we were in the war ourselves.
Segueing into the questions from our colleagues on the Zoom call, many of us in the Palisades have been enjoying Doug Dupin's Palisades History series at the Hub. And did electrification expansion affect the Palisades in any way?
Well, it affected everybody in important ways, including the Palisades, which wasn't as well developed then. But two things I can think of where the Palisades have a sort of an interesting story. One is that I didn't mention when electricity was first growing, when Edison started, almost all of the power is being sold to households. And then very quickly, offices and factories became a bigger market for utilities. And then following that, electric streetcars, which in many cities, your city of Chicago, I think the streetcars were using three times as much power as the utilities were making and selling in about the turn of the 19th century. And of course, the Glen Echo Trolley was part of that movement, building these electric railways. And many of them were built to go out to amusement parks at the end of the line. If you've got generators that are running pretty heavily during the week when factories are operating, and then they're idle on the weekend, you're wasting money. So they found a way to, they'd run these lines. They were also commuter lines for some people, but out at the end, there would frequently be some kind of an amusement park like Glen Echo, where people would go and there'd be band concerts and rides and whatnot, and they kept their generators going. So in that sense, the Palisades was part of a national trend. But the one that I found most interesting in my research, it turned out that 3 times in, I think it was from 1919 to about 1923 or 4, the Corps of Engineers in their annual proposed budget asked for money to build a large dam on the Potomac right above the District of Columbia, which I think means at Little Falls. And they wanted to do that to provide power for the government for years to come. And Pepco said, no, we've got excess power and we'll build more power if the city needs it. The Corps of Engineers, of course, is not shy about what they want to do, and they came back year after year. And basically Pepco defeated them in the House. And as a result, we don't have a big dam up here between Little Falls and Great Falls.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, yeah. You're
Um,
always looking for something to be grateful to Pepco for, weren't you?
right. Well, let's move to the larger circle here and take some questions from our colleagues. And I'm going to start in the order they've been submitted. From Carol Lynn Halal. In what ways is FDR's battle similar to our own experience trying to transition to cleaner energy sources?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And it's one I haven't thought about. Obviously, the transition, now we didn't worry about the environment when we were building up this industry in the early 20th century. And we're paying the price for that now. And the ways that we're trying to do it, there are legislative proposals, and whether we do it with taxation or subsidies or regulation, I think it may be the problem that's equivalent in scope to what Roosevelt was trying to do, but I'm not sure I see an exact parallel with just trying to build the power. Now we're trying to switch. He did sort of switch from coal to hydro. Coal was the principal fuel source at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. And with the big dams, Roosevelt switched to hydro, which, while it has its own problems environmentally, it is cleaner than coal. So in that sense, there is a little bit of a parallel there.
Jude Michaels asks, did the creation of TVA and other dams flood any towns, villages, or homes?
Yes, but not as much as you might think. TVA probably had the biggest problems. The Columbia River dams were more remote, away from settled areas. In the Tennessee Valley, people had lived for generations in the same little valley or hollow. And if one of the dams was going to flood their area, they had to leave. And it was not only an economic hardship to leave, and they got a subsidy of some kind to move, but they were losing their roots, and it was hard for some of them. And even those who got a subsidy, since so many people were moving, they wanted to stay as close as they could to the area they were vacating. Land prices went way up. It was very hard to find another farm close to where they had been because everybody wanted the ones close. And so they were pretty much unhappy. The ones that really got shafted were the renters, because they also had to leave, but they didn't get a payment for a farm. They might have got a little moving expenses, but they had nothing to go to. And there's a little bit of an argument that TVA flooded slightly larger areas than they needed to for most of their dams. And part of that was for flood control for Chattanooga. And I've seen a pretty powerful argument that you could have more effectively prevented floods in Chattanooga with other methods that you did locally in Chattanooga, rather than making bigger reservoirs, which meant taking more land in the areas where these farmers were being displaced. But I don't think towns were very often flooded.
Mm-hmm. Karen St. John asks, given your historical perspectives, do you have any observations or concerns regarding potential inadvertent consequences around a future implementation of the Clean Power Standard program that was proposed in the Build Back Better, now nixed by Senator Manchin?
Well, not so much from my historical perspective, but from my time working for Congress, I've learned that you always have to be worried about the unintended consequences. I personally think that proposal that Senator Manchin got knocked out of the bill would be very valuable in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. Whether there would be unintended consequences, I don't know. There often are, but the benefits would be huge, and we've lost them. For now, anyway.
Yeah. Carolyn asks, how much of the infrastructure built under Roosevelt, think about the electrical grid and dams, for instance, have been poorly maintained? Why is that, do you think?
I could be glib and say that's just a natural human tendency to not maintain what you've got, but part of it is when you do budgets, and these things, most of these utilities are regulated by state regulators and the federal ones by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they've got to justify what they're going to spend on it. I don't know. When you look at what they're proposing to do, it's probably pretty hard to say, well, shouldn't you spend more on maintenance? I think you probably have to have a pretty specific recommendation for something that they should be doing that they're not. Now, clearly in California, the major Northern California utility had run a lot of power lines through forests, and they didn't maintain them well enough, and they were the cause of some of those big fires out there. It's easy to look back and say, oh, in fact, I happened to go to a meeting several years ago with the Forest Service and some of the Western utilities talking about that and how they needed to do more maintenance because of the risk of fires, but they obviously didn't do enough. I can't tell you why. I can't tell you one interesting tidbit from that meeting, which I guess just shows my own ignorance. And I came into by then I was out of the government. I was working for the Aspen Institute, and I was kind of interested to see who was around the table, and they had name tags for everybody, and they had somebody over here named Chief Roberts, and I thought, oh, the Indian tribes are here. He was the chief of the Forest Service, and they call him Chief. They don't call him Mr., they call him Chief.
That's cute. I don't see any more questions, and we don't have to ask questions. The Palisades Village is blessed with people of much life experience, and maybe this has jogged some memories and some stories among those who are here. So I'm going to open up the mic, and let's share thoughts that come to mind in light of this very rich history that Jack has shared.
Let me see, Greg, if I can prime the pump a little bit with a story from my own background. Although I grew up to be a Democrat, I grew up in a very Republican household, and my father was quite conservative. His father had been a Republican county chairman in a rural county in Indiana, and he held a couple local offices. And after my grandparents had died, there was one aunt and one uncle who stayed on the farm and never married, and they were still as Republican as ever. And when I'd go to visit this one favorite aunt, she and I would always get into some good-natured political argument. And she thought Franklin Roosevelt was to blame for everything that ever happened. And I wish I had known what I know now, which is that their farm was electrified by Franklin Roosevelt's Rural Electrification Administration. I never had a chance to tweak her with that. But it would have been so much fun.
Nice, nice. Others?
There has to be someone out there with a story.
I have a story. I also come from a farm background, and my grandmother had a farm. And my uncles and everybody else, and I lived in a small rural town. And I can remember when, you know, the farm, we still had all these implements on the farm that were left over from an earlier period before electrification. And I just remember that suddenly we were able to have a large dairy herd because we could now automatically, you know, milk the cows. And before we did all that by hand. And I remember when the first television came to town on my street, and all of us sat in the dark watching it because our only experience had been with movie theaters. So we all sat there expectantly waiting to see the buffalo because it came from Buffalo, didn't come from Canada. Anyway, I just remember my family talking about the huge difference that this made, how they used to use coal lamps. They used to use how dirty these things were, how dusty they would make the house. So yes, it was a revolution. It was a revolution that occurred all over America, including especially in the farm areas.
Mhm.
We also had outhouses, by the way.
I'm sure a lot of you
that we
remember
gave
that.
up happily. Yes.
I'm sure many of you remember the TV comedian George Gobel. He used to have a line. He said, "If it weren't for electricity, we'd have to be watching TV in the dark."
Yeah, right. Well, we did.
Marianne Hartnett has her hand up. Marianne, please speak up.
Yes, I just had one comment to make. I was just recently looking at the American Civil Engineers report for infrastructure in the United States. And there are, according to them, 91,000 dams in the United States at this point. And they grade the infrastructure, all the different components, and they gave the dams a D.
Oh, good Lord.
So you've been talking about maintenance. Unfortunately, they did not get an extremely good grade. Drinking water actually got a C-.
Well, another Palisades angle. Our neighbor Bruce Babbitt and I worked at one point on a proposal to try and promote dam removal. It's not just that the current ones are not maintained, but there's some old ones that aren't used anymore that are there and collapsing, causing all kinds of problems. But nobody wants to pay to take them out. Sometimes the ownership's not clear, the small ones, and that's a big national problem. I thought that's where you're heading with the maintenance question.
Others?
Never heard everyone so quiet.
I know it. I know.
How do you send a chat? I don't know how to work this out.
You speak the way you are.
Oh, I'll speak, yes. I was curious, why was 110 volts selected for the United States as a standard voltage? When the rest of the world's at 220. Do you know what the thinking was behind that by any chance? Because it's more efficient to have that higher voltage. You can have smaller electric motors and all the rest of it. Why was that?
I'm not sure I heard all of the question, but there was a key debate early on between direct current, which Edison used, and alternating current, which Westinghouse and Tesla promoted. But once we started to get alternating current where you could carry high voltage across country, that allowed a lot of concentration and a lot of bigger dams or power plants to be built. Once that started, there was something called a superpower movement in the late teens and early 20s, where everybody wanted to connect more powers. And this dam that was supposed to be built out here by Little Falls would have been part of that.
Someone needs to mute their unit. Okay, go ahead, Jack.
I'm not sure I answered the question. I answered what I heard.
Bob, is there something left out? You want to restate or add another question?
You didn't really answer the question. It seemed odd to me, having lived in Europe for most of my life, that coming here, the voltage is half of what it is in Europe. And that means you have to have bigger electric motors and everything's more inefficient. You have bigger losses in the lines and all the rest of it. So that's something that's puzzled me. The other thing that puzzles me is why is most of the electricity that transmitted in the United States above ground? Why wasn't it buried from the get-go? I know it's a very big continent, but it seemed, I mean, the amount of trouble caused by lines blowing down and storms and so on is amazing. I know, do you know what that is? Do you have any answer to that?
Well, there's no question that a lot of lines could have and should have been buried when they were built. Of course, it costs a lot more to go back and do it retroactively. And, you know, it's a question about rates. The utilities would probably do it if their regulatory authorities would let them charge us more for doing it. On the line losses and the inefficiency of our long distance high voltage transmission lines, there's very much of an awareness about that. There's a huge cost factor there too, but there are proposals, and again, I'm not an engineer, but there are proposals to try and upgrade the quality of our transmission lines. And I've been out of government for a long time now. I don't know where that stands, but and I'm not as aware of what the Europeans are doing, whether they're doing a lot better, but we have longer distances in most cases. So any inefficiencies in our transmission lines are probably more costly for us.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. This is Karen. And I don't know if it's a question or not, but what have you uncovered in your research in terms of the motivations behind FDR's movements, especially around TVA? And you had a lot of Black sharecroppers at the time. And then you had the great migration of a lot of Black people moving up to the northern cities. So, you know, were there considerations in terms of what this electrification could do for the Black community at the time?
My guess is, and I'm not sure I've found anything in my research that would confirm this, that Roosevelt would have been very happy to do more for the Black people, particularly in the South. But given the control of Congress by the long-serving Southern senators primarily, and in the House too, who had the committee chairmanship, he had to make incredible compromises with them. For example, when Social Security started, who was left out? Domestic workers and farm workers, which were heavily Black. The town that was built as the headquarters of the TVA planning and construction had, you know, they wouldn't allow him to build a Black church. It was a very segregated town. I mean, he was working in the South, and I guess he must have decided this is a compromise I'll make because I won't be able to get the money for this thing if I cross those Southern senators. There's a phenomenal book about that whole problem by a guy named Ira Katznelson. I think he's at Columbia. And I can't remember the title now. It probably came out 6 or 8 years ago. Masterful piece.
I have a question. And
You're muted, Carol.
Yep. I have a question, and I'm sorry that I keep trying to contrast yesterday and today, but I'm going to do it anyway. Despite the battle that Roosevelt had in getting Congress to ultimately open its coffers and fund the TVA, he was more successful than we are today. What was different about Congress then? And can you speak to that about he had this battle, but nothing like what's going on now, or was it similar to what's going on in Congress?
Well, the simple answer is he had huge majorities, First it was a depression. He got
Yeah.
elected in the depression. People were ready for change. They wanted new members of Congress. They were willing to have government experiment with things in a way we're less so now. And that didn't last. He only got about 6 years of serious legislating, but that was a difference. If President Biden had that kind of a majority, we'd have this 3.5 million thing passed in a minute.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. What do you think, Greg? I think we've probably reached the end. You agree? Are there more questions? This has been absolutely fascinating. I to see this revolution that occurred in America that changed all our lives and for which we are the beneficiaries is fascinating. I have always heard very mixed things about Roosevelt, but what he achieved in his presidency is I don't think anybody has exceeded that. And just in terms of transforming America and bringing us into the 21st century. Anyway, I can't thank you enough for writing the book and for sharing it with us, Mr. Riggs. It was Jack. It was terrific. Thank you. And Greg, you did a wonderful job. Thank you for making this a conversation and not a lecture.
Great. It was a group effort. Thank you, Jack.
It was
Thank
very
you
great.
both. This was
Tremendous.
just
Yeah.
amazing. Greg, your questions just
Yeah.
led to these answers that had me going, wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I never saw those implications. I'm going to be up all night cogitating, but thank you. Thank you both.
And your book is available where, Jack?
Well, they still had a couple copies of Politics and Prose.
Uh-huh.
I was there a couple weeks ago. I was disappointed to find out today that the DC Public Library doesn't have one. If you want to go down and complain about that, I would.
Oh, definitely. Well, I think we should all go down en masse. Yes. Well, thank you. And I did see that Amazon is carrying it.
Yeah.
So yes. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you, audience, for being here and for contributing to a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. It's fantastic.